to have our owner and CEO, Captain Dan Blanchard, join us live from the docks of our home office in Juneau, Alaska. And Dan, what a day you're having there in Juneau. Welcome.
Oh my gosh. After a winter of a lot of snow, it's like sunshine just lifts the soul. So thank you, Julie. Yeah, my name is Dan, and I'm coming to you right from our dock. Behind me is our office, and you can see our little town behind us. Juneau, a town of 32,000, is coming alive right now. Yesterday we were replacing planks on the dock, and people are sweeping around town and flags are going up, all looking forward to having guests come and enjoy the beauty of Alaska. So it's a very active, very happy time in town right now. But today we're going to be talking to something that's super dear to me. We're going to be talking about our public lands. And here in Southeast Alaska, we are the Tongass National Forest. I mean, I don't think there's a home to kind of visualize this. I don't think there's a home in Juneau, unless they're buried in the forest, that can't view the Tongass National Forest right out their window. Essentially, to kind of give you a visual on this, I'm spinning over to where I live on Douglas Island, and behind me, there's a little strip. It's kind of hard to see in the distance, but there's a little strip of humanity along the water. But all those mountains that are behind there, Mount Jumbo, we call it locally, all of that is Tongass National Forest. So the Tongass National Forest makes up the vast amount of land that is available, with these little strips set aside for humanity, and which makes Southeast Alaska such a magical, wonderful place. So anyway, I'm going to come back later, turn this over to Ben in just a moment, but I'm going to come back once I'll be coming from my office, because even though it's sunny, it's still a little chilly in Juneau. But before I come back, I just want to let you know that we're making history here at Uncruise with you today, in that for the first time in history, one company was awarded 4 Best in Alaska awards in a single year, pointing towards the 2024 season. And that company is little old, U.S. owned, U.S. flagged, Uncruise Adventures. So it's fun to kind of be setting a pace that no cruise brand has ever reached. Even the big boys with all their money and massive marketing can't really provide the product that we do at Uncruise Adventures. So I will turn it over to Ben here, and I'll look forward to chatting with you a little bit later in the presentation about some practicalities and real deep thoughts on what's happening with the Tongass today, and how you and I can set this apart for the future. So Ben, I'll give it to you to take over.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for that beautiful view of Southeast Alaska and all its glory today. For those of you who have been participating in our series here for the last, we're going on our 3rd week right now. We're into our 3rd week of this series. We've been kind of providing a new perspective into the way we look at Southeast Alaska. Last week was all about behavioral psychology and what's going on in the brains and minds of the things that we see up here. 2 weeks ago, we provided sort of a day in the life of what a trip with Uncruise looks like. And this week, as Dan mentioned, we're going to be speaking to the vital role that public lands play, not only for Uncruise, but just for the entire microcosm or macrocosm of what we have up in Southeast Alaska. And we're going to be going over a few different locations specific to places that we travel, but really they do comprise most of what makes up all of Southeast Alaska. So the title of this is The Guardians of the Wilderness, and just a little introduction. If you haven't met me before, my name is Ben Marolf. I've been an expedition leader with Uncruise. I've been working with them since 2018 was my first summer aboard the vessels. I started my real journey with Uncruise in 2014 as a guest aboard the Wilderness Adventure, realized that it was a job that I could have and I could spend time up in Southeast Alaska, and came back as soon as possible and have been working with them ever since. My background is in biology and environmental science, very similar to any expedition leader or guide that you would have on board any of our boats. And what really matters most, though, is that I'm incredibly passionate about Southeast Alaska, and I'm excited to share some little blurbs with you today about the different public lands in Southeast Alaska that we access week in and week out. So we're going to start with this kind of large-scale overview. So the map that you're seeing on the right side of the screen is a map of all of what we consider Southeast Alaska. Southeast Alaska, again, is that kind of strip of land that you see that separates British Columbia to the east, and then the greater Pacific Ocean to the west. And it starts all the way down south near Ketchikan and makes its way all the way up to the outer coast of Glacier Bay National Park and Yakutat and inland, all the way up to Skagway and Haines. And the map that you're seeing here is really indicative of how important public lands are, not only to ecotourism in Southeast Alaska, but really to the critters that we see up there and the incredible wildlife that everyone comes to visit. So the dark green that you're seeing is all comprised of the Tongass National Forest. The Tongass National Forest is absolutely massive, about 16.7 million acres of land. We're going to talk more about it later, but you can really see how dominated Southeast Alaska is by the Tongass National Forest. The light green that you're seeing kind of in the northwestern corner of Southeast Alaska is Glacier Bay National Park, also federal land. The dark blue blotches that you're seeing are state land, often accessible state land, public lands in that sense. The light blue are all owned by Alaska Native corporations. And then finally, the little orange dots that you're seeing, that is the privately owned land. And they're pretty much just focused around city centers in Southeast Alaska. So Southeast Alaska truly is dominated by our public lands, and there's really no privately owned land outside of the very small parcels that are owned in the cities. And we're going to go over what public lands are from a really broad view. So what I like to tell people when they get on our boats is that public lands are your lands. They are our lands as folks who live in the United States, but we also offer them up to folks who are coming in to visit from really anywhere else. And public lands are one of the great ideas that we had in this country, and they have just really served us well over the years. And Southeast Alaska is no exception to that rule. It is incredibly important for us to be really long-term visioned in terms of how we think about our public lands in Southeast Alaska and really across the nation from a broad perspective. There is so much benefit that having healthy public lands provides not only to local communities, but particularly to the ecosystems that help make those communities special and help make these places what they are. And so we're going to dive into 4 different locations all across Southeast Alaska that really dominate our public lands. And we're going to start with the largest, and that is the Tongass National Forest. The Tongass National Forest is a truly special place. It is the largest carbon sink in the entire hemisphere, the entire northern hemisphere. It's kind of our version of the Amazon rainforest, if you want to think about it that way, providing more land-based carbon cycling than any other pocket of land on Earth. It is kind of the keystone of the largest coastal temperate rainforest on Earth, stretching from the northern edge of Southeast Alaska all the way down the coast of Southeast through British Columbia, down through Oregon and Washington, and ending its southern end on the kind of central California coast. So from the Redwoods all the way up to northern Southeast Alaska, the coastal temperate rainforest is the dominant ecosystem, and the Tongass National Forest is a huge part of that. It is massive and it is incredibly biodiverse. So when we think about why folks are coming up to visit Southeast Alaska, the Tongass National Forest really provides habitat for this really special creatures that we get to see up there, like the brown bear, the black bear, the largest population of bald eagles on Earth, the humpback whales, the orca, the salmon, and the list really goes on. The Tongass is home to some of these iconic species. When we talk about the coastal brown bear, which is the largest major subspecies of brown bear on Earth, the Tongass is the most important place for that species. If it weren't for the incredible amount of rain that we get, we wouldn't have the streams, and the streams provide home for the salmon. And the salmon provide the largest return of nutrients from sea to land on the planet, bringing with them so much from a wildlife perspective of access to those salmon, including the bears, eagles, orca, whales. Again, the list goes on, and it all has to do with the fact that our forests up there are healthy. Without healthy forests, we don't have healthy streams. Without healthy streams, we don't have healthy salmon populations. Without healthy salmon populations, everything sort of breaks down. And the Tongass is truly the home of a lot of the things that folks are coming up to Alaska to enjoy and to experience. And it's really a gift to be able to experience a place like the Tongass National Forest, where it is so wild and so non-dominated by human engagement or human activity really of any kind. Moving on to what a lot of folks come to Southeast Alaska to get to go visit for a couple days, Glacier Bay National Park. Glacier Bay is my favorite place in all of Southeast Alaska. It was set aside in the early 1900s for research and made into a national park in the 1980s, and it is a crown jewel of Southeast Alaska. It is one of the only places on Earth where you can go and actively see the processes of glacial succession. And so it has been a real cornerstone for glaciologists and scientific research since the park's founding. It was carved out not only by the Pleistocene ice age, the major ice age 20,000 years ago, but the most recent glacial push in Glacier Bay only took place about 400 years ago with the Little Ice Age. And so we're able to study and see these crazy shifts in what an ecosystem looks like when you start from what I describe as nothing, right? An area where ice has just scoured away the landscape and all you are left with is dirt and rock. And how does that landscape turn into a really dynamic coastal temperate rainforest over the course of, you know, 1 generation, 2 generations, 7, 8 generations? How do we get from point A to point B? And Glacier Bay is the kind of preeminent study area for that, for glaciology, really on Earth. And it is just filled to the brim with kind of access to really wild, remote places that we just don't get anywhere else. Uncruise is the only company that I know that every single time we make a trip into Glacier Bay, we have access to get on land in the park if we want to. Less than 1% of visitors to Glacier Bay National Park are actually able to get off the boat and see these things. And that's something that we just really hold dear to our hearts. And getting to access Glacier Bay from land is something special. And it allows us to really talk to the scientific research and different conservation efforts that are happening in Glacier Bay National Park, not only 10, 20 years ago, but are actively being researched right now. And when it comes to Glacier Bay, the wildlife in Glacier Bay is really highly protected. Glacier Bay is a humpback whale marine protected sanctuary. And so when we are in the park, that is one of the only places that we go where we will not be actively whale watching, because it is so important for those whales to have a place where they can be unbothered by boats, unbothered by significant marine travel. And we do our best to maintain those rules and regulations to the letter of the law. It is a place that is really special to not only the wildlife, but also to the indigenous peoples of Southeast Alaska. The Huna Tlingit, which are essentially a really active indigenous tribe in the area, have been co-managing Glacier Bay National Park with the National Park Service. And it is the first, I believe, effort between a national park and a local peoples to actually co-manage a place. And they have done just an incredible job. Glacier Bay is wild, it is remote, it is untouched. And it's one of the reasons that we go visit it. Really a special place to get to see with your own eyes. Moving on, we're going to be discussing a little bit about Admiralty Island and Admiralty Island National Monument. So Admiralty Island is a very large island just southwest a little bit of Juneau, and it is highly regulated in a good way. It is incredibly important to the local bear species, the coastal brown bear that dominate Admiralty Island, as well as Baranof Island and Chichagof Island. In Southeast Alaska, our bear species kind of split or segregate based on island. On the mainland, you can find both brown bears and black bears. But when you get out into the Alexander Archipelago, each island has its own, essentially, little species of bear that dominates that space. And Admiralty Island is special because of its high alpine peaks. The same goes for Baranof Island, and the same goes for Chichagof Island. Brown bears, when they den up for the winter, like to make their way up high into the alpine to an area that's going to have maximum snow cover. What maximum snow cover provides for the bears is essentially maximum amount of time that they can stay in a warm spot in hibernation. And without having those really high alpine areas to access to hibernate in the winter, the bears are forced to leave their dens a little bit earlier, and that's not good for the overall health of the bear or for the species in general. And so Admiralty Island as well as Baranof and Chichagof Island, are really these strongholds for the coastal brown bear. And as a result, the indigenous peoples, they recognized that, tens of thousands of years ago. And the name for Admiralty Island for the Tlingit population is called Coots Nawu, which in English means fortress of the bear. And it couldn't be a more apt term. There are more brown bears on Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof than you can pretty much find anywhere else on Earth. The brown bear population of Admiralty Island is healthy. It is doing well, but there are still significant conservation efforts and challenges year in and year out to maintaining that incredibly healthy population. As you can imagine, an apex predator like the brown bear or something like the orca has just such a huge role for the ecosystem as a whole. And so when we go into places like Admiralty Island, we make sure that we're following really sustainable tourism practices. And Admiralty Island is one of these places where we can only put a certain amount of people on land per day. And so our smaller vessels like the Safari Quest or the Safari Explorer will generally get permits for this area that some other boats just won't be able to get because of how nimble and how small we are. We're able to access these really rare places, these kind of unknown, untrodden bays and hidden nooks and crannies to be able to access and get a chance to see some of these really productive salmon streams, get a chance to see the brown bears of Admiralty Island. It's really a spectacular place to get to visit. Moving further south, our itineraries that run between Ketchikan and Juneau, as well as our northbound and southbounds through the Inside Passage, get the opportunity to go to what I think is maybe the hidden gem of Southeast Alaska, and that is Misty Fjords National Monument. Misty Fjords is situated near the city of Ketchikan and is also incredibly large, approximately 2.3 million acres of land protected in the National Monument. And this monument was described by John Muir as the Yosemite of the North, because the same sort of factors that carved out Yosemite, this deep glaciation, carved out Misty Fjords National Monument. And the geology of the area is really similar, with really towering, huge granite walls, just massive expanses of space. And it's characterized by these deep, narrow fjords essentially being a glacially carved valley that is now filled with water. And when we're traveling through Misty Fjords, picture Yosemite in your mind, just filled with water, but then take away all of the people that are there. Because Southeast Alaska is so huge, because it is so remote, because it is so difficult to access, we often have these places to ourselves. We'll go 2-3 days in the National Monument without seeing another group of folks around. And just what a special way it is to access a place like that. And because of how rare it is to see folks in the area, the wildlife in Misty Fjords is really diverse as well. There's a number of different black bears. There are mountain goat species that are in the park or in National Monument. There are some wolf packs that move through the area. Obviously a ton of bald eagles. And then frequently, this is a place where we get the chance to see a transient pod of killer whales that I've seen moving through that area a number of times. When it comes to a recreational perspective, there's a lot of opportunities to get out on the water. Because it is a fjord and the walls are quite steep, we often focus on getting out in kayaks or paddleboards or going for skiff tours, just looking for wildlife as we go. It also holds great significance to the indigenous peoples. There were 2 different clan homes that were in the back of a place called Walker Cove that we visit very frequently. And it's just a really magical place. And when you go there, it's one of those places where I'm wishing that it's not a blue sky day. I'm hoping for those gloomy kind of overcast days when it comes to Misty Fjords National Monument, because it just has that feel, that aesthetic of mist, of allure. And it's just a really special place to get to go travel, and is a keystone to the sort of southeastern part of Southeast Alaska. It is one of the most diverse places that we travel from a wildlife perspective. And I've touched on that a little bit. And it's also been a kind of a focus point of different conservation efforts and different ecotourism efforts, because the National Park Service does manage Misty Fjords National Monument and is responsible for its conservation and protection. There are constantly efforts being made to protect the area's natural ecosystems and wildlife while still providing opportunities for public enjoyment and engagement while you're in the park or while you're in the monument. So we've given you a brief overview of the sort of 4 cornerstone locations that we go in Southeast Alaska between the Tongass National Forest, which really dominates a lot of our time, Glacier Bay National Park, which we have really exclusive and special access to land there, Admiralty Island National Monument, which is, home to the coastal brown bear and is really highly regulated and protected, and then also Misty Fjords, sort of a hidden gem tucked away south of Ketchikan. But there's something that I want to address and talk a little bit about here, and that is the roadless rule. And what the roadless rule is it is essentially a rule that was enacted back originally in 2001 by the Clinton administration as a means to protect pristine forest areas from development and resource extraction. And in Southeast Alaska, this couldn't be more important because the Tongass National Forest is such an important part of the ecosystem up there. And without the forest, again, we don't have the streams. Without the streams, we don't have healthy salmon populations. Without healthy salmon populations, you get the idea. Things sort of fall apart. And the roadless rule applies currently to the Tongass National Forest, which protects those 9.3 million acres of roadless area within its boundaries. Roadless meaning no roads can be developed in those areas, which would allow for commercial logging to access those places. Now, logging does have a long history in the Tongass. Pretty much everywhere that we visit in Southeast Alaska is in fact second growth forest, because 95% of the Tongass's 9.3 million acres were logged anywhere between 60 to 100 years ago. Now, that was all clear cut. That was all done kind of before we had a really good idea of the ecological significance of this space. But looking forward to today, now that we have a better understanding of how important a really healthy forest is for the long-term success of the ecosystem in Southeast Alaska, we need to kind of recognize that this roadless rule is sort of under attack again. There have been multiple different efforts over the last few decades to either rescind by whatever sitting administration is currently in the White House, or re-implement the roadless rule by whatever administration is in the White House. So it's kind of been a back and forth effort where there's a lot of different lobbying from the timber industry and different legal and controversial disputes that are going on. But the most recent effort is happening right now, and the Tongass is kind of once again a little bit under attack in terms of the forest and access to logging, with the roadless rule once again being potentially rescinded, which would mean that commercial logging would re-enter the Tongass, and the entire ecosystem that we have up there, that we have access to up there, that the wildlife relies on, could potentially be decimated again. And that would have just incredible economic impacts to the long-term sustainable tourism efforts that are occurring up there. It would have pretty devastating impacts to the biodiversity that relies on the Tongass National Forest. And there's certainly a conversation to be had about, how do we approach logging in Southeast Alaska? How do we manage this resource in sustainable ways? And I want to touch on a couple folks that we visit from time to time. There is a family outfit, father and son, in a place called Corner Bay. And they have been sustainably logging in Southeast Alaska, picking and choosing certain trees, certain stands that can handle a little bit of logging here and there. And so I think there's definitely ways that we can go about this where different parties are appeased and we can still protect the forest in general. But it certainly comes with its set of challenges and different controversies that are happening right now. And I would like to bring back Dan to talk a little bit more about this, if he's available to speak on it, because Dan is intimately tied to what's going on up there right now. He has a really great understanding of the current efforts that are taking place, and there he is. So Dan, you want to speak on this for a little bit?
Yeah, kind of switched up where it's a little warmer inside, Ben. Like I was saying, it's beautiful weather up here, but it's still chilly and there's a little bit of breeze starting to develop. But yeah, as Ben was saying, this is, my entire career, or I should say most of it in Alaska, which has been almost 40 years, has been, kind of plagued with the roadless rule in, the roadless rule out. Generally, those decisions being made from afar. It's interesting that in the Forest Service surveys that they have taken over the years, as high as over 90% of the people of Southeast Alaska, the roughly 75,000 residents, vote in favor of a roadless rule or a revised state-specific roadless rule, but they are in favor of the roadless rule. So it's interesting, you know, when we talk as a nation about local control and local government, that the people of Southeast Alaska are profoundly for the roadless rule, but whether it's the federal government or even our own state government, that is not always true. So, you know, we're working right now on another attack that is happening. And this one's being brought, unfortunately, by our own state. And even though the people of Southeast Alaska want some revision or some roadless rule in place that could either be an adjusted roadless rule, but they don't want to get rid of the roadless rule. And it's kind of interesting to know, before the last administration basically got away with and said no roadless rule anymore, myself, others in both the timber industry, the hunting industry, the fishing industry, we had all gotten together. A great group called Salmon State really led the charge on a lot of this, along with other conservation groups here in Southeast Alaska. And we had met and for years trying to come up with this kind of idea of an altered roadless rule that would probably not make everybody super happy, but is pragmatic and works and makes us a better community. And I will say that involved on Prince of Wales Island, a road that was going to go to a mine, but a mine that was obviously being taken care of in an ecological manner. It included a road over the top of the island, where catch cans at, to allow them to get to these cuts that were valuable to the industry, but didn't get the view shed torn apart or heavy bear areas damaged and this type of thing. So it's really interesting for me as an Alaskan to sit here and go, you know, we all came together. We were pragmatic. We compromised. And then with the swish of a pen, it was wiped out in the previous administration. So these kind of things we are still working towards. The roadless rule is in place right now, but threatened. And we're still fighting it. So, you know, Ben, I think that's kind of the update I have for you right now. I will say that Uncruise is involved with Earth Trust and other organizations in legal action to keep the roadless rule in place. We believe the roadless rule, you know, needs to be there, and it needs to have compromise. We need lumber from our own forest. Why ship it from Canada or the lower 48? You know, we need our big game outfitters and this type of stuff that are part of our economy to be able to work. We have a couple of mines that are already here that are doing a great job on keeping the environment as a priority. And so I don't want you to think we're all crazies that are just going to the far end saying the place has got to be locked up. It's finding that really good balance that kind of works for everybody and doesn't make everybody extremely happy, but it's a compromise is what we're working on in the forest. And we believe that's the long-term best when people come together. And my gosh, that terrible word in politics today, compromise. Anyway, Ben, I'll leave it with you. And also just let everybody know that in the follow-up email, we'll have a link to action that my friend Dan, who runs Salmon State, provided for us, that gives you the opportunity to, you know, look at ways you can support the Tongass and the roadless rule going forward. So Ben, thank you very much for this, and I'll be in the background for a bit.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these efforts, you know, these places that we consider to be protected in perpetuity, places like, you know, Glacier Bay National Park, places like Misty Fjords National Monument, places like the Tongass National Forest are, you know, they're at the discretion of what's ever going on at the top right now. And so we're doing our best to maintain these places from an ecological perspective, because it is so important to the long-term future and success of the ecosystem in Southeast Alaska. The ecosystem that we see has value intrinsically. Outside of what we do as an ecotourism operation, the ecosystem itself has value as what it is. If no people were up there in Southeast Alaska, if no one ever saw it, the ecosystem would still have value. And I think it's important to remember that that different conservation groups, different indigenous communities, and all sorts of other stakeholders are continuing to advocate for the preservation of the roadless area within the Tongass National Forest, really emphasizing, the ecological, cultural, and different recreational values of this landscape. So there's a lot that's going on. It's more complicated than we can get into in an hour-long presentation. But if you feel compelled to do something about this, Uncruise is really doing our best to lead the charge on this front. We are a company that not only focuses on showing people Southeast Alaska, but also advocating for the voiceless, which in this case is the bears and the whales and the salmon. And so I've attached a couple links right here. Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, or SEAC, they do a ton of phenomenal work in Southeast Alaska. The Sitka Conservation Society, an organization that we have employees of Uncruise who are also volunteers on their board. They're just an amazing, amazing group. And then, as Dan mentioned earlier, Salmon State, which has really led the charge for a lot of the advocacy to maintain the roadless rule in Southeast Alaska.
And hey, Ben, I might just interject very quickly. It looks like we have Dan Kirkwood from Salmon State joining us right now. He's in the chat room. So if anybody has any questions, I certainly appreciate you, Dan, for joining us in this webinar. And then I think Aileen dropped that link in there as well, and I'll be sure to put that in the follow-up email.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. Yeah, throw some questions in there for Dan if you have any. And we'll try and answer some right here at the end if there's anything pressing that we haven't covered. But as a note, this is our second to last presentation of this series. And so we have got one webinar left for the month of March. And next week, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Jewel of Southeast Alaska, we're going to be doing a webinar that is fully discussing Glacier Bay National Park. The title of that being Glacier Bay National Park, A Journey Through Time and Ice. And we'll include a link to register for that webinar in our follow-up email as well. And so unless there are any questions, and I'll leave a little bit of rambling space here for someone to let me know if there are, I will once again close with and teach you a Tlingit word. It's Gunal Chish, and that is Tlingit for thank you for listening to what I have to say, for listening to this talk about the importance of public lands in Southeast Alaska. And we will hopefully see you all next week for our fourth and final webinar in this series. And I really appreciate y'all taking some time out of your day to hang out with me.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I love this. Let's wrap up your presentation with this really great video that you have here. I just went through the questions. It doesn't look like there's anything totally outstanding except for a lot of amazing comments about your presentation today. So let's roll this and we'll start wrapping up today's presentation.
There are about 70,000 people that live here in Southeast Alaska. We're going to have 1.3 million visitors this year alone.
Coolest thing I've ever seen my entire life.
Is wilderness important?
I didn't really know what to expect. I knew it'd be beautiful. I had hoped we'd see a lot of wildlife, but I just didn't realize it would be so unspoiled.
Alaska is just nature.
Can you imagine the day is going to come where I'm going to have to tell my guests that you're the last ones? You're the last ones to experience Southeast Alaska with a roadless rule. Over the years, we really didn't give industrial logging a lot of thought because most of that had ended by the early 90s. And so when we found out that they wanted to clear cut an extremely large portion of North Keyou, we were just dumbfounded. I think as our world has gotten smaller, or maybe a better way to say it is wilderness has gotten smaller in our world, there's more of a yearn for wild places. And Alaska is one of just a handful that really exists that's untouched. So, is wilderness important? That's why they're here.
But until you get here and you experience it up close, you can't fully understand what it's like.
You get that like awe-inspiring feeling that you really only got when you were a kid, you know?
We've had a really fun trip, like bears, ginormous whales.
Will you guys come with us on every trip?
My business needs wildness. Americans and foreigners from all around the world come to Alaska not to see a clear cut, not to see roads, but to see the beauty of a natural setting that is wild and free.
Oh, that video always tugs at my heartstring, and I just want to thank Dan. What a terrific job you did with that video. I see some comments in the chat saying they're so appreciative for the local perspective of Alaska, and I know your heart and soul is from this area. And I just want to thank both Ben and Dan for highlighting the importance of preserving the wildness of Southeast Alaska and shedding light on such crucial work that's being done to protect these natural treasures that we have up there. You know, it's so incredibly inspiring for me to see the general emotion, that genuine emotion from young kids in the video where the one little boy says, Alaska, it's just, and he pauses and says, nature. And how awesome for that. So family travel up there is so important. So a big thank you for shedding the light on that. I'm just wrapping up the webinar. I want to speak to those of you interested about Uncruise Adventures. Perhaps you've never heard of us, or maybe you're curious about what the small boat cruising's all about. You can certainly go to uncruise.com and go into our ship section, and you can take a virtual tour of any one of our vessels. So you can go into the cabins, you can check out the exterior decks on board. Just get a sense of how close you'll be to these incredibly wild and free lands up in Alaska. And if you're intrigued by the idea of joining Uncruise to explore an insider's trip on Alaska or any one of our other incredible destinations, we also go to Hawaii, Baja, as well as the Galapagos. Make sure you explore our Leap into Savings offers. These are the best offers we'll be having for 2024. And all of our trips are lifetime and life-changing experiences that we bring not only to you, but the entire family on board. So you can certainly check out that QR code if you want to take a quick second and just take a snap of your phone. That'll take you right to all these great offers that we have right now. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us for yet another amazing presentation in this series. A heartfelt thank you to both Dan and Ben for sharing yet another great topic of Southeast Alaska and what we might expect on board an Uncruise adventure. To inquire more about space or to secure your booking in Alaska, we invite you to call our amazing adventure specialist at 888-862-8881, or you can certainly email them at sales@uncruise.com. We're looking forward to have you joining us next Thursday when Ben takes us to a journey through time and ice, exploring, of course, that jewel in Southeast Alaska, Glacier Bay National Park, which, by the way, all of our vessels will touch Glacier Bay at least 1, if not 2 days. So if you're curious to know, if it's been on your bucket list to visit this national park, it's a don't miss presentation. So with that, I'm wishing you all fair winds and following seas, and see you next Thursday. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.